Folks don't understand this issue because they're either not from Utah or Idaho or Wyoming or some of those states out west where the majority of the land is actually owned by the federal government. As part of statehood and a long history of this, upwards to 70% of Utah is what's considered public lands.
You're watching Restoring America, where we shine a light on the fundamental values of this country and all the reasons why they're worth saving. This week, we're going to talk about one of the ways the federal government is violating states' rights. I'm Kaye McGee White. Let's get started. If you live on the East Coast like I do, or if you're from the Midwest like I am, you might not realize it, but a good chunk of the American West is still controlled by the federal government. In fact, 70% of Utah's land is managed and controlled by the Bureau of Land Management. This means the state is unable to develop that land, even in ways that could economically benefit the state or preserve its environment. And as mentioned, the state has to answer to the Bureau of Land Management for the management of that land, which means that Utah has to answer to a federal bureaucracy that is thousands of miles away and often out of touch with the people its decisions affect. Utah is trying to change this and is bringing the question to the Supreme Court. Does the federal government have the right to prevent states from managing their own land? At the heart of this question lies the principles of federalism. And that's really what this is about. Who gets the final say? The federal bureaucracy or the state governments? My guest today is going to explain more on this, but before we get to him, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe, and for more, head to washingtonexaminer.com. With me today is Representative Blake Moore, a congressman from Utah and who serves as the vice chair of the Republican Conference. He also sits on the House Budget and the House Ways and Means Committee. Congressman, thanks so much for being here. You wrote a recent op-ed for the Washington Examiner about the issue of land sovereignty. And I didn't know that this was an issue before, and I assume that most Americans wouldn't either. Can you tell us a little bit about how so much of your state's land is still controlled by the federal government?
Yeah, and that's actually what we run into mostly is folks don't understand this issue because they're either not from Utah or Idaho or Wyoming or some of those states out west where the majority of the land is actually owned by the federal government. As part of statehood and a long history of this, upwards to 70% of Utah is what's considered public lands. And it is a real issue for folks in this kind of back and forth between who has the decision-making authority over what takes place in our states. If you're from a state out east, there's a very small percentage. You can use all of this land in a certain way. You can have some of it for recreation, some of it for conservation, some of it for property development, and you can earn revenue and tax revenue off of that. We don't get a chance to do any of that. And that's over 70% of our land. So it's a real limiting factor for folks. And essentially the op-ed just basically talks in its most simple form. We are asking the Supreme Court to rule on whether or not the federal government has the right to retain unappropriated land. Of course, we have the most beautiful landscapes in Utah. All of our national parks, the Zion National Park, Arches, and the like, military establishments, areas that are as appropriated. This doesn't touch that. We love that. It's working. We're doing a lot there. There's obviously things to fix, but this is about just the land that exists unappropriated. Who has a right to be able to make decisions on this? And that's what we're saying, that Utah should be able to have that.
And you mentioned two key problems with the way that the situation is currently set up. There are the economic disadvantages to your state because your state is not able to manage most of its land. And then there is the problem of the fact that the state has to answer to a federal agency thousands of miles away that is largely unaccountable to your own citizens. So can you explain more about those issues?
Let me explain it in a very simplified way that I think that folks would better understand. The concept of grazing, which you might not have been expecting me to talk about today. Grazing is when you put cattle out on a field and they're able to just churn through that foliage. They need something to eat and they're able to keep it down. That's actually one of the best prevention measures for a forest fire.
Interesting.
The federal government and BLM will come in with these arbitrary rules that you can't manage or you can't do, we can't have our ranchers out on these particular lands for X, Y, or Z factor that usually don't make sense to us. Again, it's a lot of disconnect between what we see locally and what you see out of a Washington, D.C. bureaucracy. And all of a sudden the negative externality is that we are running a major potential of forest fire, because grazing is actually a good thing for the land. And we've proven that over, centuries of raising cattle and other type of livestock on this, and it's essential. That's the kind of thing where these become really difficult decisions that need to be done. And it'll extend into conservation efforts. It extends into but recreation and things like that. It's just, we are very close to it. We've seen what works. We live with it. It's our air. It's our water. We have to breathe it. We have to be there. We want it to be done in the most responsible way possible. And oftentimes, the limitations that are put on a big, broad government regulation might have been done for something that existed in, say, Iowa, that doesn't apply to Utah, and the factors of Utah are different. But when you do these broad, sweeping regulations, it doesn't work, and it becomes a negative detriment, because forest fires are bad. We should prevent them, and we can do that by policy that we know better.
And in your state's case before the Supreme Court, which you mentioned, one of the main arguments that you guys have been driving home is that really this comes down to the principles of federalism and whether states have the right to do what's best for their citizens and their land. Are you hopeful that the Supreme Court in this case will uphold the principles of federalism? What do you expect moving forward?
Yeah, I think it will be consistent with what we've seen out of the makeup of this Supreme Court. Federalism is a fundamental aspect of our country. And if we embraced it more, we wouldn't be having so many of the issues that we're having with regards to some of the things like debt, deficit, and the programs that we established. We can't do every program in our government from Washington, D.C. This is why we have more local authorities that are closer to the issue, being able to develop a lot. And we as a federal government need to allow for more of that to happen.
Absolutely. Well, thanks so much for joining us. And for more exclusive interviews, breaking news, and conservative views, be sure to check out washingtonexaminer.com.